My name is Alara. For 25 years, I was the reliable one, the daughter who paid the utility bills, who fixed the leaking roof, and who made sure my parents' prescriptions were always filled on time. I didn't mind. I loved my family, and I loved our home, a spacious three-bedroom apartment in the city center filled with light and memories. My brother, Julian, was the dreamer. He was always one investment away from millions, always chasing the next big thing, and always coming back to us for rent money. I was the anchor, he was the sail. But sails are meant for show, and anchors are meant to be dropped. On my 26th birthday, my parents handed me not a gift, but an eviction notice. They were giving the three-bedroom sanctuary, the one I had physically maintained with my own salary, to Julian. Why? Because a boy needs to build a family, Alara, and you're so independent, you'll be fine. They handed me the key to my new beginning, the derelict, collapsing tool shed on the overgrown, useless plot of land on the industrial edge of the city, land that had been in our family for generations but was too poisoned to sell. They thought they were giving me a life sentence in the dirt. They didn't realize that dirt is exactly what you need to start growing. The air in the apartment always smelled like lavender and my mother's baking, a scent that had anchored my sense of safety for my entire life. But that afternoon, as I walked into the sun-drenched living room, the lavender seemed suffocating, a floral mask for something rotting underneath. My parents, Silas and Elena, were sitting on the sofa, flanked by my brother, Julian. Julian, at 30, still carried the soft, untroubled look of a man who had never had to deal with consequences. He was looking at a set of blueprints on the table, a hungry gleam in his eyes. "Ilara, sweetie, sit down," my mother said, her voice dripping with the practiced sweetness she used when she was about to ask me to pay for an emergency roof repair. "We need to talk about the future." I sat across from them, my stomach tightening. "Is everything okay? Is the new investment failing again, Julian?" Julian scowled. "No, Ilara, this is actually about a real success. As you know, I'm planning to propose to Serena next month. We're ready to start a family." "That's wonderful, Julian," I said, a faint hope rising. Maybe he was finally moving out. "And a family needs space," Silas, my father, interrupted, his voice booming with the false authority he always used when he was about to make a decree. "They need a foundation, a proper home, not a rented apartment. We've discussed it, Elena and I, and we've decided to make a transfer." My mother picked up the deed from the table. It was the deed to the apartment we were sitting in, the spacious three-bedroom home that my grandmother had left, technically to my parents, but which I had spent the last 5 years physically restoring and emotionally maintaining. I had renovated the kitchen with my own hands, replaced the windows with my own salary, and paid the property taxes every year when my father's investments came up short. "We're giving Julian the deed," Elena said, her voice now dangerously calm. "This apartment is his, as his inheritance. He and Serena need the space for children. They need the location." I stared at them, the world seeming to lose its color. You're giving him the apartment? Where I live? Where my things are? The apartment I have paid for? "We all contributed, Ilara," Silas snapped, though he couldn't look me in the eye. "Don't act like a martyr. This is about the family legacy. Julian is a boy. He carries the Vance name. He needs to build his dynasty." "And what do?" I whispered, my voice cracked, the betrayal feeling like a physical blow to my chest. Elena smiled, the lavender smell suddenly feeling repulsive, a floral mask for something rotting underneath. "Oh, darling, we haven't forgotten about you. You know that plot of land we inherited from grandfather, the one on the old mill road?" My stomach dropped. The old mill road. It was an industrial nightmare. It was a patch of contaminated dirt, bordered by a collapsing factory and a freeway where the city's outcasts camped and where developers refused to look. "You're giving me the wasteland?" I gasped. "We're giving you the title," Silas declared, as if he were handing me a royal decree. "It's a huge plot, and the best part is the old tool shed is still standing. It's sturdy. It's perfect for someone like you. You love a project, Ilara. You're always fixing things. This is your chance to build something that's entirely yours." He reached into his pocket and placed a single rusted iron key on the table. It looked like something used to lock a dungeon. "You have until the end of the week to clear your things out," Elena said, her tone final. "Julian wants to start the renovations before Serena sees the place. He wants to knock down the wall between your bedroom and the living room to make a grand dining space." I looked at the blueprints. My bedroom, the room where I had studied for my engineering degree, where I had cried over heartbreaks, where I had spent years planning a life I thought was secure, was marked with a large X. It was being erased, just like I was. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. A cold, heavy clarity settled over me, a realization that everything I had given this family had been a transaction they had accepted with a polite smile while never intending to honor the debt. They loved my reliability. They worshipped Julian's potential. I picked up the rusted key. It was heavier than it looked. Packing my life was easier than I expected. I didn't own a lot of flashy things. I owned tools. I owned drafting paper. I owned books on urban planning and structural engineering. I packed the tools I had used to build their sanctuary, and I realized with a grim satisfaction that I wouldn't be leaving the kitchen I had renovated behind. I took my customized cabinets, I took my handmade shelving, I left them the lavender smell and the memories, but I took the infrastructure. Silas and Elena watched me leave with a mixture of pity and relief. Julian was already at the apartment, ordering Serena a cappuccino, planning to expand the balcony over the street with minimal permits. I arrived at the old mill road at dusk. The sky was the color of a fading bruise. The huge plot grandfather had left me was an acre of cracked earth, choked with invasive weeds and industrial waste. The factory next door loomed like a rotting corpse, its windows shattered, its smokestacks silent but ominous. And there, in the center of the dust, was the tool shed. It was a nightmare of rusted corrugated metal and decaying timber. The door was hanging by a single hinge, and the roof had collapsed on one side, allowing a view of the freeway overpass that loomed overhead. The ground inside was covered in oil stains and decades of accumulated grime. I stood there, holding my key, and I didn't cry. I didn't feel despair. I felt a massive, liberating surge of anger, followed by an even colder surge of calculations. They thought they had sent me to die, but they sent an engineer to a landfill. I put my bags down, I took my grandfather's rusted key and forced it into the padlock of the collapsing door. The lock groaned, but it turned. "Home," I whispered into the dusty, oil-smelling air. I spent the first night under a tarp I strung across the remaining roof beams. The traffic on the freeway overhead was a relentless grinding roar. The air was thick with the scent of burning tires from the encampments nearby. But by dawn, I was at work. I didn't focus on making it a home. I focused on making it a fortress. I reinforced the timber with salvaged steel from the surrounding factory yards. I patched the roof with more corrugated metal I bartered from a junkyard. I used my salary, which used to pay for my parents' lavender-scented life, to buy industrial-grade filters for the water line and a rugged, portable generator. 6 months. It took 6 months to make the shed livable. It was small, efficient, and ruthlessly functional. My tools were organized with military precision. My drafting table was centered under the new skylight, salvaged glass. But while I was building my fortress, I was also studying. I was studying the city charter, I was studying the tax laws, I was studying the industrial zoning regulations of the old mill district. I realized that Silas and Elena, in their haste to banish me, had given me more than contaminated dirt. They had given me a strategic position.
The old mill district was expanding, the city was running out of development space, and developers were starting to eye the industrial edges. The factory next door was in probate, and the surrounding vacant plots were owned by a series of shell companies that hadn't paid taxes in years. Silas and Elena thought they had given me dust. I realized I was sitting on a dormant gold mine. I started a new type of fixing. I didn't fix roofs, I fixed tax records. I used my knowledge of urban bureaucracy to purchase the tax liens on the factory next door and the vacant lots around my shed. I set up my own shell company, Vance Reclamation, and began systematically acquiring the ownership of the entire old mill industrial block for pennies on the dollar. I was no longer paying for my parents' lavender-scented life. I was paying to own the ground they walked on.
The roar of the freeway overhead had become a lullaby of industry. In the year since I had been discarded, the tool shed had transformed. From the outside, it still looked like a rusted relic of a forgotten factory, a perfect camouflage. But inside, it was a high-tech nerve center. My drafting table was now flanked by dual monitors displaying real-time land registry data and municipal zoning maps. I had wired high-speed satellite internet through a salvage dish on the roof and installed a gray water filtration system that would have made a billionaire's penthouse jealous. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the only expensive thing I owned, and watched the cursor on my screen. I was waiting for the final confirmation from the city clerk's office. "Done," I whispered as the screen turned green. Vance Reclamation, my shell company, had just finalized the purchase of the narrow, forgotten strips of land that bordered our family's apartment building in the city center. Most people think they own the air above their heads and the ground beneath their feet, but property is a jigsaw puzzle. My parents owned the 3-bedroom box. They didn't own the 4-foot-wide maintenance alley behind it, nor did they own the triangular patch of public utility land that sat directly beneath their living room balcony. I did. I owned the air they were about to build into. A notification chirped on my phone. It was an Instagram post from Serena, Julian's fiancée. It was a photo of her and Julian standing on the old, narrow balcony of the apartment. They were holding champagne glasses, and Julian was pointing toward the street with a triumphant grin. Breaking ground today, turning this tiny ledge into a 200-square-foot sky terrace. Who needs a backyard when you have the city at your feet? Hashtag Vance Vantage, luxury living, expansion. I zoomed in on the photo. Behind them, I could see the scaffolding being erected. Julian hadn't just hired a contractor, he had hired a cheap one, a man known for cutting corners and forgetting to check the latest cadastral maps. They thought the street below was public property managed by the city. They didn't realize that in an obscure land swap deal 30 decades ago, that specific street had been reclassified as a private industrial access easement, an easement that had just been sold to Vance Reclamation to pay off back taxes. I stood up and walked to the small, reinforced window of my shed. The old mill factory next door was now mine, too. I had already sent in a crew of security contractors, mostly quiet, tough men I'd met in the district, to fence off the perimeter. I wasn't just building a house, I was building a perimeter. A week later, I received a phone call. It was my mother. Her voice was uncharacteristically frantic, the usual lavender-scented calm replaced by the shrill tone of a woman whose social standing was under threat. "Elara, are you there? We've been trying to reach you for days. Why don't you answer your brother's texts?" "I've been busy, Mother," I said, my voice as flat as the industrial landscape around me. "The fresh air you sent me to has a lot of work attached to it. How is the expansion going?" "That's why I'm calling. There's a man here, a surveyor. He's telling Julian's construction crew that they have to stop. He says the scaffolding is encroaching on private property. He's threatening to call the police and file for an immediate injunction." "Private property?" I feigned confusion, though my heart was a steady, rhythmic drum. "I thought you owned the apartment." We do, but he says the air 6 inches past the railing belongs to some company called Vance Reclamation. Julian is furious. He's shouting at the man, but the man just keeps pointing to a digital map. Ilara, you know about these things. You're an engineer. Can you look into this company? Find out who they are? Maybe you can, I don't know, talk to them? Vance Reclamation. I repeated the name slowly, tasting the irony. I've heard of them. They've been buying up a lot of distressed assets lately. Industrial ruins, tax lien strips. They're very aggressive, Mother. I don't think they talk to people who violate their boundaries. But it's just a balcony. Julian has already paid $40,000 for the custom steel beams. They're sitting on the sidewalk. If he can't install them by Friday, the permit expires and he loses the deposit. Please, Ilara, help your brother. He's building a home for your future niece or nephew. I'll see what I can find, I said, and hung up. I didn't wait. I drove my old beat-up truck into the city center. I parked 3 blocks away and walked to the building. It was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was reflecting off the windows of the 3-bedroom sanctuary I had once loved. Julian was on the sidewalk, his face a deep mottled red, screaming at a man in an orange vest. The orange-vested man, my surveyor, was holding a tablet and calmly pointing to a red line that ran precisely 6 inches from the building's facade. "I don't care about your red line," Julian roared. "This is my family's building. We've lived here for 40 years. You can't own the air." "Actually, sir," the surveyor said, his voice amplified by the quiet street, "the air above a private easement is part of the title. If you extend that balcony, you are trespassing, and since you've already drilled the support anchors into the exterior wall, which according to the map is the boundary line, you are technically already in violation." I stood on the opposite corner, hidden behind a bus stop, watching the spectacle. Silas and Elena were on the balcony, looking down with expressions of sheer horror. They looked old. They looked small. Julian spotted me. "Ilara, get over here. Tell this idiot he's wrong." I walked over, my boots clunking on the pavement. I looked at the surveyor, then at the scaffolding, then at the rusted iron key I still kept on my keychain, the one Silas had handed me a year ago. "He's not wrong, Julian," I said, my voice carrying a weight that silenced my brother's shouting. "I checked the records this morning. This easement was sold last month. Whoever owns Vance Reclamation, they didn't just buy the dirt, they bought the rights to every square inch around this building." "Well, find out who they are," Julian spat. "Offer them $1,000, $5,000, whatever it takes to get them to sign a waiver." "I don't think they want $5,000, Julian." I looked up at my parents. Silas's eyes met mine, and for a split second I saw a flicker of doubt in his expression. "Just like you wanted this apartment." "You're useless," Julian turned back to the surveyor. "I'm calling my lawyer. We'll sue this company into the ground." "Good luck with that," the surveyor muttered as he folded his tripod. "I've been instructed to file the injunction by 5 o'clock today." I walked away as Julian began to kick the steel beams on the sidewalk. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. They had sent me to the old mill to disappear in the dust. They hadn't realized that the dust would eventually follow them home. That night, back in my shed, I drafted a formal letter on Vance Reclamation headerland. It wasn't an offer to talk. It was a notice of intent to construct a security perimeter around the old mill industrial hub. But the security perimeter wasn't for the factory. It was for the apartment building. I had just secured the permits to build a 10-foot-high industrial-grade sound wall along the easement line. The wall would sit exactly 6 inches from Julian's windows. It would block the sun. It would block the breeze. It would turn their luxury apartment into a dark, airless box. I sipped my coffee, the generator humming a steady, powerful tune. They wanted a family home. I was going to give them a tomb. The air in my shed was cool and filtered, a stark contrast to the heated, desperate atmosphere I knew was thick in the Vance apartment. My monitors showed the legal filings. Julian's lawyer had attempted to challenge the easement ownership, claiming prescriptive rights. They failed. You can't claim prescriptive rights on industrial-zoned land that has been under a tax lien for a decade. Vance Reclamation, my shadow, was bulletproof. I sat at my drafting table, not drawing pipes or beams, but the final elevations for the acoustic shielding partition. To the city, it was a necessary industrial barrier to mitigate the noise from the nearby transit hub. To the Vances, it was a guillotine. "Ms. Vance, we have a formal request for a meeting," my assistant, a sharp legal clerk I'd hired from the city's zoning department, said over the encrypted line. "A Mr. Julian Vance and his legal counsel. They're offering to negotiate the air rights for the Sky Terrace. Tell them the CEO of Vance Reclamation doesn't do face-to-face meetings with minor residential claimants," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Tell them all offers must be submitted in writing, and inform them that our construction crew for the boundary wall arrives on site tomorrow at 6 a.m. The next morning, I drove to the city center, but I didn't go to the apartment. I went to the rooftop of a parking garage across the street. I pulled out a pair of high-powered binoculars and watched the spectacle unfold. A flatbed truck carrying massive precast concrete slabs pulled up to the curb. My crew, men who moved with a silent, professional efficiency, began unloading the pillars. These weren't decorative fences. These were industrial sound barriers, 10 feet high and finished in a dull, soul-crushing gray. I saw the balcony doors fly open. Julian ran out in his bathrobe, waving a piece of paper. My mother followed him, clutching her throat. They looked down at the sidewalk, where the first pillar was being lowered into a hole drilled precisely 6 inches from their building's foundation. "Stop! You can't do this!" Julian's voice echoed off the surrounding buildings. "I have a pending court date. You're blocking my light." The foreman, a man I'd instructed personally, didn't even look up. He just pointed to the permit taped to the side of the truck. "Private easement, sir. Utility and Sound Mitigation Project 402. We have every right to be here. You, however, are currently standing in a construction zone. Please step inside for your own safety." By noon, the first 3 slabs were up. From my vantage point, I could see what they did to the apartment. The living room, which used to be flooded with the golden light of the afternoon sun, was suddenly plunged into a cold, artificial twilight. The view of the park across the street was gone, replaced by a wall of rough-hewn concrete. My phone buzzed. A text from my father, Silas. "Ilara, for God's sake, pick up. This company is destroying us. They're building a wall right in front of our windows. Julian's fiancée is in hysterics. She says she won't move into a bunker. Please, use your engineering contacts. Find out who owns this company. We'll pay. We'll sell the car. Just make them stop." I waited an hour before replying. "I looked into it, Father. Vance Reclamation isn't interested in money. Their legal brief says they are optimizing the industrial utility of the district. It seems they find your balcony expansion a liability to their future development. Maybe if Julian hadn't been so loud about his luxury expansion on social media, they wouldn't have noticed." "Don't be cruel, Ilara. We're family." Family. The word tasted like ash. They remembered we were family when the sun went out. They didn't remember it when they handed me a rusted key and told me to live in an oil-stained shed. That evening, a formal settlement offer arrived in my inbox from Julian's lawyer. They were offering $15,000 for a light and air easement. It was a pathetic amount, barely enough to cover the cost of the concrete slabs I'd just installed. I drafted the counteroffer myself. I didn't send it from my personal email. I sent it from the official, cold, anonymous address of Vance Reclamation.
to counsel for Julian Vance, re-encroachment and easement dispute. Vance Reclamation is not interested in your financial settlement. However, we are willing to halt the construction of the sound wall and grant a 10-year air rights lease under the following conditions. 1. All construction on the unauthorized Sky Terrace must cease immediately, and the scaffolding must be removed at the resident's expense. 2. Julian Vance must sign over 50% of the apartment's title to Vance Reclamation for collateral for future zoning compliance. 3. A formal public apology must be issued to the displaced party regarding the Old Mill Road inheritance, admitting to fiduciary negligence. You have 24 hours. If no agreement is reached, the wall will be extended to 20 feet in height, covering the second-floor windows as well. I hit send and watched the confirmation flicker. I knew Silas would recognize the terms. I knew he would see the ghost of the daughter he'd discarded in the language of the contract. But I also knew he was trapped. Julian had leveraged the apartment to the hilt for his failed investments and this luxury renovation. If the project died and the value of the apartment plummeted because of the wall, the bank would foreclose within months. I sat in my shed, the only light coming from the glow of my monitors. I felt a strange sense of peace. The reliable daughter was dead. The architect of the enclosure was just getting started. Through my remote security feed at the construction site, I saw the lights in the apartment flickering. They were arguing. I could see Julian pacing back and forth in front of the concrete wall, his shadow dancing against the gray stone. He looked like a caged animal. He thought he was building a family. He didn't realize he was just decorating a prison.
The sound of a luxury sedan's tires crunching on industrial gravel was a foreign noise in the old mill district. I watched the security feed on my primary monitor. A black Mercedes, covered in the gray dust of the construction zones it had passed through, pulled up to the perimeter fence of my plot. Silas stepped out, coughing as the acrid smell of the nearby chemical plant hit his lungs. He looked at the rusted exterior of my tool shed and straightened his silk tie, as if preparing to grant an audience to a beggar. He didn't know that the rusted exterior was now backed by 3 inches of reinforced ballistic steel and soundproof insulation. He didn't know that the fence he was standing next to was equipped with motion sensors that had already alerted my private security team. I pressed a button on my console, and the heavy industrial gate slid open with a low hydraulic hum. Silas flinched at the sound. He walked toward the shed, his polished shoes ruining themselves in the oil-soaked dirt he had gifted me. I opened the door before he could knock. The interior of the shed was bathed in the cool blue glow of 6 high-definition monitors. The air was crisp, scrubbed clean by an industrial filtration system. Silas froze in the doorway, his mouth hanging open as his eyes swept over the racks of servers, the high-end drafting equipment, and the digital maps of the city center displayed on the walls. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice cracking. What is all this? Where did you get the money for this equipment?" "I didn't buy it with a trust fund, Silas," I said, not looking up from my screen. "I bought it with the salary I used to spend on your heart medication and the property taxes for the apartment you gave to Julian. It turns out, when you stop subsidizing a sinking ship, you have a lot of capital left over for a shipyard." Silas walked further into the room, his hand hovering over a 3D model of the city center. "The settlement notice, the 50% equity, the apology. It was you. You are Vance Reclamation?" I turned my chair to face him. I didn't look like the tired girl who used to fix his leaky faucets. I looked like the woman who owned the ground beneath his feet. I am, and you're trespassing. Unless, of course, you've brought the signed deed and the notarized apology." "How could you be so cold?" Silas roared, his old fake authority returning for a desperate moment. "Your brother is in a crisis. Serena is pregnant. They are living in the dark because of those concrete slabs you put up. We are your family, Ilara. We gave you this land." I stood up and walked to the wall-mounted map, and I tapped a section of the Old Mill District. Asset Summary. Vance Reclamation Holdings. Plot A, the shed, 100% ownership, gifted. Plot B, the factory, 100% ownership, tax lien purchase. Plot C, the utility easement, 100% ownership, private sale. Total district control, 84% of industrial access. "You gave me a death sentence, Silas," I said, my voice as cold as the concrete outside their window. "You gave me a plot of land you thought was worthless because you were too lazy to check the new zoning laws. You thought I would rot here. Instead, I used this dirt as collateral to buy the factory next door. I used the factory to buy the easements, and now I'm the reason your luxury apartment has the market value of a parking garage." "We'll sue you," Silas hissed, though his eyes were darting around the room, realizing he was outmatched. "A judge will see this for what it is: harassment, revenge. A judge will see a private company exercising its rights to mitigate noise on its own land, and a judge will see a son who attempted to build an illegal cantilevered balcony over a private easement without a permit. If you go to court, Silas, you won't just lose the apartment, you'll go to jail for building code fraud. Julian used my forged signature on the initial permit application, didn't he? I have the forensic report right here." Silas paled. The silence in the shed was absolute, save for the hum of the servers. He realized I hadn't just been building a wall, I had been building a cage. "What do you want, Ilara?" he asked, his voice defeated. "You already have the money. You have the power. Why do you need to humiliate us?" "I don't need to humiliate you, Silas. I need you to understand the value of an anchor. You dropped me because you thought I was a weight. Now you're drifting in a storm of your own making, and I'm the only solid ground left. You sign the papers, or I file the criminal complaint against Julian tomorrow morning. By noon, the bank will pull the mortgage, and you'll be living in the street by the end of the week." I slid a high-end fountain pen across the metal desk. Beside it lay the legal documents already prepared and waiting for his signature. "Julian, he'll never survive this," he whispered. "He'll survive exactly the way I did, in the dirt. Let's see if he's an engineer, Silas. Let's see if he can build a life without a sister to pay for the bricks." Silas looked at the pen, then at the glowing monitors that showed the dark, concrete-blocked windows of his home. With a trembling hand, he reached for the paper. "The security monitors in my shed didn't just capture video, they captured thermal signatures, acoustic vibrations, and the frantic, jagged heartbeat of a man who had never been told no." I watched the red silhouette of Julian's SUV tear through the industrial gravel of Old Mill Road. He didn't stop at the gate this time, he rammed it. The heavy iron groaned, the magnetic locks holding firm, but the frame buckled under the weight of his rage in his expensive leased vehicle. Julian stepped out of the car, a heavy construction sledgehammer in his hands, the very tool he had bought to knock down the walls of my bedroom to make his dining room larger. He was screaming, his voice lost to the wind and the grind of the nearby freeway, but his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. I didn't open the door. I didn't even stand up. I sat at my console, my fingers hovering over the override keys. I had spent months programming the defensive protocols of this plot, treating the land like a circuit board where every intruder was a short circuit that needed to be isolated. "Open the door, you thief!" Julian's voice finally breached the soundproofing as he struck the reinforced steel of the shed's exterior. Clang! The sound resonated like a funeral bell. Clang! I opened the external intercom, my voice amplified and distorted through the industrial speakers mounted on the roof. "Julian, you are currently damaging private property owned by Vance Reclamation. The gate you hit costs more than your monthly mortgage payment. I suggest you put the hammer down before the automated systems register you as a high-level threat." "Automated systems? You're a freak, Ilara!" He roared, swinging the hammer again. "You trapped our parents. You forced Dad to sign that paper. That apartment is mine. I have a kid on the way, and you're living in a goddamn computer lab built on poison. I'm going to smash every screen in there until you give me the deed back." He moved toward the side of the shed, where the external cooling units for my servers were located. If he smashed those, the hardware inside would melt down in minutes. He raised the hammer, his muscles tensed with the thrill of destruction. I pressed the active deterrent key. "Security protocol, Zone 1, override. Status, perimeter breach detected. Action, deploy non-lethal harassment measures. Systems, high-frequency acoustic emitter, HFEA, and CO2 fire suppression." A high-pitched, invisible wall of sound hit Julian instantly. It wasn't a noise you heard with your ears. It was a vibration that rattled your teeth and turned your inner ear into a dizzying whirlpool. He dropped the hammer, clutching his head, his knees buckling. Before he could recover, the external fire suppression vents erupted, blinding him with a thick, freezing cloud of CO2 gas. He stumbled back, coughing and gasping, falling onto the oil-stained dirt. I opened the heavy steel door and stepped out. I wasn't carrying a weapon. I was carrying a tablet. "The air out here is thin, isn't it, Julian?" I asked, looking down at him. "Kind of like the air in your apartment now that the wall is up." You tried to kill me," he choked out, his eyes red and streaming. "I tried to stop a vandal," I corrected. "Everything you just did is recorded on 4 different 4K cameras. The ramming of the gate, the attempted destruction of the cooling units, and the verbal threats. I don't even need to sue you, Julian. I just need to call the police, and your new beginning with Serena will start in a holding cell." "Why?" he hissed, crawling toward his damaged SUV. "Why? We're your family. We gave you this place so you'd have a roof over your head." "You gave me this place because you wanted me to be invisible," I said, stepping closer. "You wanted a servant who didn't take up space. But you forgot one thing about engineers, Julian. We don't just occupy space, we define it." I tapped a command on my tablet, and the monitors on the side of the shed flickered to life, showing him the legal status of his own life. "Legal standing, Unit 4B, Heritage Lane. Title holder 1, Vance Reclamation, 50%, undivided interest. Title holder 2, Julian Vance, 50%, encumbered by debt. Occupancy status, conditional lease subject to board approval. Zoning status, non-compliant, illegal balcony anchors." I told him, my voice as cold as the gas that had just blinded him. "Dad signed the paper. I now own half of your home, and as a co-owner, I've decided that the apartment is no longer a single-family residence. I've filed for a partition suit. Do you know what that means, Julian? It means a judge will order the property to be sold at auction so the proceeds can be split between the owners. And guess who the only bidder will be at that auction? Guess who has the cash to buy the other half for pennies because the windows are blocked by a concrete wall?"
Julian stared at me, the realization finally sinking in. He wasn't fighting for his home anymore. He was fighting for the right to be my tenant. You're going to kick us out? Serena? The baby? No, I said, a slow, predatory smile crossing my face. I'm an engineer, remember? I believe in efficiency. You can stay, but you'll stay on my terms. You'll pay rent to Vance Reclamation. You'll remove that scaffolding yourself by hand. And every time you look out your window at that gray concrete wall, you'll remember the day you told me that a boy needs a dynasty. Your dynasty is currently living in a box I built for you. I'll fight you, he whispered, but the hammer was still lying in the dirt, and his SUV wouldn't even start. The impact with the gate had triggered the fuel cutoff switch. With what, Julian? You have no money, no title, and a criminal record for trespassing that I'm about to file. You're not a dreamer anymore. You're a liability. I turned around and walked back into my fortress, the heavy door sliding shut with a final echoing thud. I sat back at my desk and pulled up the blueprints for the next phase of the old mill redevelopment. The apartment in the city was no longer my goal. It was just a pawn I'd captured on the way to the king. My real work was here, in the dirt, where I was turning a wasteland into a kingdom that would eventually swallow the city whole. I watched the monitor as Julian sat in his broken car, weeping in the shadow of my shed. He looked small. He looked unreliable. He looked exactly like the girl he had tried to erase a year ago. I sipped my coffee and began to draft the eviction notice for the second floor of the apartment building. I had just found out that the neighbor was looking to sell. By the end of the month, I wouldn't just own half of Julian's home. I'd own the ceiling above his head, too. The anchor wasn't just dropped anymore. It was pulling the whole ship under.
The silence of the Old Mill District was a tool, but the noise of the city center was a weapon. I sat in my command center, watching the live feed from the hallway of the Heritage Lane apartment. Julian and Serena had managed to clear the scaffolding, but the view from their living room was still a vertical desert of gray concrete. They were living by candlelight and floor lamps, the electricity bills skyrocketing because the sun no longer did its job for free. But the 50% equity deed in my drawer was a skeleton key. In this jurisdiction, a co-owner has the right to occupy or lease their portion of the undivided interest in a property. Julian thought he was sharing a home with a silent partner. He didn't realize I was about to invite the neighborhood in. "Ms. Vance, the tenants are ready for move-in," my assistant informed me. "I've vetted them according to your specific criteria: high-impact lifestyle, minimal regard for social hierarchies, and an absolute legal right to be there. Send them in," I said, my voice cold and rhythmic, "and ensure the locks on the primary bedrooms are reinforced. I want the common areas to be communal." I drove to the apartment that afternoon. I wasn't wearing my work boots. I was wearing a sharp, charcoal suit. I looked like a foreclosure notice in human form. As I stepped into the lobby, the doorman, a man who had ignored me for years when I was the handy daughter, bowed his head in a silent, terrified greeting. He knew who owned the air now. I opened the door to Unit 4B with my own key. The smell hit me first, expensive candles trying to mask the scent of damp concrete and Serena's stress-induced herbal teas. Julian was sitting at the dining table, surrounded by legal papers and half-empty takeout boxes. Serena was on the sofa, her hand on her pregnant belly, staring at the gray wall 6 inches from the glass. "What are you doing here, Alara?" Julian snapped, his voice brittle. "We signed the papers. We removed the scaffolding. The construction crew stopped. What else do you want?" I'm here to exercise my rights as a co-owner, Julian, I said, stepping into the middle of the room. The apartment is 3,000 square feet. Since I own half and you own half, it's inefficient to let 1,500 square feet of my investment sit empty while you pile up trash in the kitchen. What are you talking about? Serena whispered, her eyes wide. I've leased my half of the interest to a collective of professional musicians and digital creators, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. They need a central location for their 24-hour streaming sessions. Since this is an undivided property, they have full access to the kitchen, the living room, and the balcony area. They should be arriving now. As if on cue, the elevator dinged. 4 young men and women entered, carrying amplifiers, lighting rigs, and a drum kit. They were loud, vibrant, and utterly indifferent to the Vance legacy. "Hey, this the place?" the lead drummer asked, dropping a heavy hardware bag onto the polished hardwood floor I had hand-sanded 3 years ago. "Sick lighting in the back, but the living room is a bit dark, isn't it?" "Ilara, you can't be serious," Julian screamed, jumping up. "This is a private residence. Serena is pregnant. You can't bring a rock band into our home." "I'm not bringing a rock band into your home, Julian. I'm bringing tenants into our asset. As co-owners, we share the common spaces. If you find the noise or the presence of others distressing, you are more than welcome to sell your 50% share to Vance Reclamation. I've even brought the updated purchase agreement. It's significantly lower than last month's offer, given the depreciated living conditions of the unit." I placed the document on the table right next to a cold pizza crust. "Purchase option, residential equity buyout. Property, 128 Heritage Lane, Unit 4B. Offer price, 30% of fair market value, adjusted for wall encroachment. Terms, all cash, 24-hour closing, immediate vacancy. Clause, all legal claims against Vance Reclamation regarding Old Mill Road to be dropped." "You're a monster," Serena sobbed, standing up to retreat to the bedroom. "I'm managing an asset, Serena," I said, watching the musicians begin to set up their studio in the middle of the living room. One of them had already plugged a high-wattage amplifier into the wall and started a rhythmic, bone-shaking bass line that made the chandeliers rattle. "If the reliable daughter had been treated with an ounce of respect you're now demanding, we wouldn't be here. But you wanted an empire, Julian. Welcome to the construction phase." I stayed for an hour, watching the chaos. Julian tried to call the police, but the musicians showed their legal sublease from Vance Reclamation. The police couldn't do anything. It was a civil matter between co-owners. The apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet arrogance, was now a loud, vibrating cage of social friction. My parents arrived 10 minutes later, summoned by Julian's frantic texts. Silas walked in and nearly fell over a guitar case. Elena looked at the gray wall, then at the tattoos on the lead singer, then at me. "Ilara, stop this madness," Silas begged, his voice trembling. "We'll move, we'll leave. Just give us enough to buy a small cottage somewhere. Don't do this to your mother." "You had a cottage, Silas," I said, pointing toward the door. "It was a tool shed on the Old Mill Road. You told me it was perfect for someone like me. Why isn't this communal living perfect for someone like Julian? He loves an audience, doesn't he?" I walked to the door, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I turned back one last time. "The offer on the table expires at midnight. After that, I'm bringing in the second shift of tenants, a group of industrial metal sculptors who need a space for their welding projects. I'm sure the sparks will look lovely against that gray concrete wall."
I left the apartment and walked down to the street. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up to the 4th floor. Through the windows, I could see the flashing lights of the streamers' rigs and hear the dull, repetitive thud of the bass. I felt a cold, engineering satisfaction. I hadn't just broken their pride, I had dismantled their reality. They thought they were the masters of the house, but I had shown them that a house is just a box made of rules, and I was the one who wrote the rules now. As I drove back to the old mill, my phone buzzed, a notification from the land registry. Notary alert, title transfer pending. Status, signature received, Julian Vance. Status, signature received, Silas Vance. Total equity acquisition 100% successful. I tapped the screen, confirming the transaction. The apartment was mine. Every lightless window, every gray concrete slab, and every inch of the polished floor. The ship was officially at the bottom of the ocean. Now it was time to build something new on the surface.
The moving trucks left Heritage Lane at dawn. I watched from the sidewalk as Julian, Silas, and a heavily pregnant Serena loaded the last of their salvaged belongings, mostly clothes and a few pieces of jewelry Serena hadn't yet pawned, into a rented van. They didn't look like the Vances anymore. They looked like refugees from a war they had started themselves. "Where are we supposed to go, Alara?" my mother, Elena, whispered, her eyes red from crying. "You took the apartment. You took the bank accounts. We have nowhere left." I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the same rusted iron key Silas had handed me a year ago. I placed it in his trembling palm. "The old mill road," I said, my voice as cold as the morning mist. "The deed is still in your name, Silas. I never officially transferred the shed back to Vance Reclamation. It's your new beginning. After all, you told me it was a sturdy place, perfect for someone who loves a project." Julian looked like he wanted to strike me, but he saw the 2 private security guards standing behind me, their faces expressionless under their tactical caps. He got into the van, slammed the door, and drove away, heading toward the industrial edge of the city. I followed them, but not in a beat-up truck. I drove my new electric SUV, the silent motor a hum of pure power. As we approached the old mill district, I saw Julian's van slow down. He was looking for the wasteland. He was looking for the cracked earth, the piles of tires, and the rotting factory. But the wasteland was gone. During the year I had spent fixing the shed, I had been busy with the larger circuit board. I had finished the redevelopment of the entire block. The freeway overpass was now shielded by elegant glass acoustic barriers. The rotting factory had been stripped to its steel skeleton and rebuilt into the mill lofts, the most expensive, high-tech creative space in the city. The dirt was gone, replaced by manicured industrial gardens, sleek black asphalt, and designer street lighting. My tool shed was still there, but it sat like a preserved museum piece in the center of a lush, private park, surrounded by a 10-foot electrified glass perimeter. District status, Vance Tech Corridor, VTC. Security, Level 4 encryption, private biometric access. Zoning, elite industrial residential mixed use. Valuation, plus 1,200% increase since 2025 acquisition. Julian stopped the van at the main gate of the district. A security kiosk staffed by a man in a crisp uniform blocked his path. "State your business," the guard said, his hand hovering over the gate controls. I own the plot at the end of the road. The tool shed. I have the key." Silas stammered, leaning out the window. The guard looked at the rusted piece of iron and then at the computer screen. "That plot is an in-holding within the Vance Tech Corridor.
You have residential access to the structure, but you do not have access to the private amenities, the filtered water grid, or the district's high-speed network. And per the bylaws, your vehicle is non-compliant with emission standards. You'll have to park in the visitor's lot, 2 miles away, and walk in. I pulled up next to the van. The window of my SUV slid down silently. The walk will be good for the soul, Julian. It's a beautiful park. I designed it myself. Just make sure you stay on the gravel paths. The grass is private property. They spent the afternoon dragging their suitcases through the pristine designer landscape of the district I had built. People in expensive athleisure wear, residents of the new lofts, watched them with curiosity and mild disgust. To the new elite of the old mill district, my family looked like the very outcasts they had once wanted me to be. When they finally reached the shed, it looked exactly as I had left it, except I had removed the industrial filters and the generator. It was just a metal box again, sitting in the middle of a multi-million-dollar garden. They couldn't even cook a meal without the district's smart grid access, which I had blocked for their specific inholding. "There's no water," Serena screamed. "Julian, the toilet doesn't flush, and it's 100 degrees in here." "You wanted to build a family, Julian," I said, leaning against the glass fence of the park, watching them from the outside, which was actually the inside of my kingdom. "This is where I started. I fixed the roof with salvaged tin. I bartered for my water. I survived the noise of the freeway. Now you get to survive the silence of my success." Silas sat on a designer stone bench just outside the shed's door. He looked at the towering glass lofts, the vibrant gardens, and the woman I had become. He realized the true scale of his mistake. He hadn't just given away a daughter, he had given away the architect of the future. "You could have had all of this, Silas, if you had just treated me like a human being, instead of a tool. You could have lived in the penthouse of the factory loft. Instead, you're the only poor person in the richest district in the city. You're a living monument to your own greed." "Please, Alara, Serena is 8 months pregnant. She can't stay in a shed with no AC." "I'm an engineer, Silas. I believe in solutions," I said, checking my watch. "I've arranged for a local charity, one that I fund, to bring a crate of bottled water and some dry rations every morning. It's exactly what the city provides for homeless encampments. After all, isn't that what you told me this place was for? Someone independent like me?" I turned my back on them and walked toward the mill loft's entrance. My staff was waiting for the board meeting. There were bridges to build and more land to reclaim. As I entered the climate-controlled lobby, I could hear the faint sound of Julian trying to hammer a piece of wood over a broken window in the shed. Clang, clang, clang. It was the same sound he had made when he tried to destroy my life, but now it wasn't the sound of an expansion. It was the sound of a man trying to keep the dust out of his eyes in a world that had moved on without him.
The legal fees for Julian's final attempt at a lawsuit were paid for by the sale of Serena's last designer engagement ring. They had filed for an emergency injunction claiming humanitarian negligence and malicious zoning. They sat in the sterile, high-tech courtroom of the municipal building, looking like gray ghosts against the vibrant digital displays of the city's modern legal system. "Your Honor," Julian's lawyer stammered, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "My clients are living in a metal shed with no climate control, surrounded by a multi-billion-dollar luxury district. Ms. Ilara Vance is intentionally isolating them. She owns the water lines, the power grid, and the very air filtration of the old mill. This is corporate torture." I stood up. I didn't need a lawyer to speak for me. I had the blueprints. I had the deeds. I had the truth. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of a woman who had built her own foundation, I am providing the occupants of Plot A with exactly what they provided me, a sturdy structure and the fresh air of independence. If they find the conditions unlivable, it is only because they lack the engineering spirit they once claimed I possessed. However, the point is now moot. The Heritage Lane apartment is gone. The courtroom fell silent. Silas gasped, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table. Gone? What do you mean gone, Ilara? You bought it. It's our family's legacy. I tapped a command on my tablet, and the main screen of the courtroom flickered to life. It was a time-lapse video, taken from the very parking garage where I had once watched their scaffolding fall. Project log, Vance Reclamation, Site 0. Location, 128 Heritage Lane. Action, structural deconstruction and easement expansion. Reason, non-compliable zoning and structural fatigue. Result, public urban park and ventilation corridor. The video showed the apartment building being systematically dismantled, not blown up, but taken apart, brick by a crew of silent, efficient machines. The 3-bedroom sanctuary, the kitchen I had renovated, the balcony Julian had tried to steal the sky with, it was all reduced to sordid piles of rubble and recycled steel. The last frame of the video showed the empty space where the building had stood. It was now a small, serene public park, a green lung for the crowded city center. In the center of the park stood a simple, elegant sculpture, a weathered iron key, 12 feet tall, cast in bronze. The building was structurally unsound due to illegal modifications to the load-bearing exterior walls, I explained to the judge. As the 100% owner, I exercised my right to demolish a liability. I donated the land to the city for a permanent public easement. There is no family home to return to, Julian. There is only a park where people can breathe, something you never allowed me to do. The judge looked at the documents, then at the shattered faces of my family. The law is clear, Mr. Vance, the judge said, closing the file. You sold your interest. You signed the waivers. Ms. Vance has operated within every municipal code. Case dismissed. Outside the courtroom, the air was sharp and clear. Silas approached me, his hands shaking. He looked at the photo of the new park on my tablet. You destroyed it, he whispered. Everything we built, everything the Vance name stood for. I didn't destroy it, Silas. I recycled it, I said, looking him in the eye. The Vance name doesn't stand for a 3-bedroom apartment anymore. It stands for the lofts in the old mill. It stands for the cleanest water in the district. It stands for the girl who didn't need your permission to exist. What do we do now? Julian asked, his voice hollow. Serena was sitting on a bench nearby, staring at nothing. Her dream of a luxury dynasty turned to dust. You have the shed, I said, and I've decided to be generous. I'm offering you a job, Julian. My reclamation crew needs someone to sort the scrap metal at the North Yard. It's hard work, it's dirty, and the pay is exactly minimum wage. But it's a project, and you always said I loved a project. Julian looked at me, the rage in his eyes finally replaced by a cold, terrifying realization. I wasn't his sister anymore. I was his gravity. He had no choice but to fall. I walked to my car, the electric motor purring as I started the engine. I drove through the city, passing the new park at Heritage Lane. I saw children playing near the bronze key sculpture. I saw a young woman sitting on a bench, sketching in a notebook, the sun hitting her face without a concrete wall to block it. I drove back to the old mill, to my penthouse in the converted factory. I stood on my balcony looking out over the district I had built from poison and neglect. The freeway roar was a distant hum, silenced by the glass barriers I had designed. I took the original rusted key from my pocket, the one that had started it all.
I didn't throw it away. I placed it in a small glass display case on my desk. It wasn't a memory of a betrayal anymore. It was a trophy. I opened my laptop and began to draft the plans for the next city. There was so much more land to reclaim, and I was the only one who knew how to find the gold in the dirt.